Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started with some announcements while folks come in. So this session is being hosted by the UX Researchers Guild. And by attending this session, you do consent to our recording, editing, and maybe using this content for educational and marketing purposes. So this session is being recorded. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel later. To facilitate some networking, we're going to have our standard breakout room sessions following today's chat. So if you want to stick around for the breakout room networking, please do so. Otherwise, we have a networking spreadsheet that you can use if you'd like to share your LinkedIn details, connect with others. Finally, I want to announce our next upcoming Guild event is another UX Research Rumble, our 6th Rumble, and we will be discussing what is the role of a researcher in evangelizing findings. So should you be judged based off of your impact or the research that you're conducting, we will hash out the two sides of that debate in July. So look forward to that. We do have a giveaway today. So for our next book club meeting, which will be in September, we're going to be reading Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Perez. And we will be giving away a copy of that book to some lucky person who has a very thoughtful question during today's discussion. You must be located in the United States to receive that copy, just a heads up, but hopefully we'll get thoughtful questions from everyone. So please participate so that you can be entered into our giveaway. Okay, I'm going to pass the mic over to Lija Hogan, and she is our host for today's book group. So Lija, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Danielle, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I know it's a variety of different times of day for people who are on today's webinar, but I'm really excited to have this conversation with Steve. By way of a little bit of an introduction for myself, I'm a board member at the UX Research Guild. I also work at user testing and lecture at the University of Michigan. And I'm joined by author Steve Portigal. He wrote the most recently second edition update to I think one of the most important books that I've read as a researcher, which is Interviewing Users. And hopefully you've had a chance to read it as well. But it's really focused on helping you to establish and evolve your practice of doing research with people, having great conversations with them. And so before we get started, I wanted to share just a little bit more about Steve, give him a little bit more of a introduction. He's a consultant who helps organizations to build more mature user research practices. And over the past 25 years, he's had a lot of experience interviewing hundreds of people, including families eating breakfast, film production accountants, hotel maintenance staff, architects, radiologists, home automation enthusiasts, credit default swap traders. I bet that was interesting conversation too. And rock musicians. And as a result, he's informed the development of commercial lighting controls, medical information systems, professional music gear and design systems, and wine packaging and work from home practices. Pretty much if you've tried to do anything, he's probably done some work around it. And in addition to having written the classic Interviewing Users, he's also written Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries, User Research War Stories. And finally, if he's not busy enough, he's the host of the Dollars to Donuts podcast, which I highly recommend. It's, great conversations. So welcome, Steve.
Oof, I'm exhausted from that. Thank you. That's a very sweet introduction. Thanks for having me here.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I'm really excited for this conversation because I loved your book. I just want to, start out. And actually, over the years, I have recommended it and had people read it for classes. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. So to start out with, a lot of folks on today's call are experienced researchers, and they've probably been doing interviews, for quite some time themselves. And I think, we all have an opportunity to get better. But given what you've learned between the first and second edition, what stands out to you the most in terms of how your practice has evolved over that time and how that practice, I guess by extension, really informed your second edition?
When you write a second edition, you get asked, well, why a second edition? What has changed? And you asked that question in a refreshing way, because I think so I'm avoiding your answer, but I will get there. The question is often about what have been the external circumstances that changed. Because, I resisted writing a second edition for a while because I felt like, well, this work is evergreen. Like, I'm sorry, this book is evergreen. It describes these very human behaviors of listening and asking questions and following up. But what has changed most dramatically is the circumstances in which we do this work. And so but your question kind of pushes me to think about, well, what has changed in the practice, in my practice, that showed up here. I feel like on one hand, there are just some fundamental principles or approaches that I think remain the same. What's changed for me is, 10 more years of doing them and also teaching, like my work, like you. I do research and I teach people how to do research. There's nothing like being in an environment where you're explaining to somebody else how to do something to make it more clear to yourself, right? That's you got to figure it out in order to teach it. And I've had I've had 10 more years of teaching and being in these situations with people and seeing how they approach, whether it's just a follow-up question or asking a run-on question or asking any sort of thing that we do that's not ideal, and watching people struggle and succeed, hearing them explain back to me how they do it. And I feel like even if I'm still offering the same, like around the practice part, again, the context has changed, but around the practice part, I think if my guidance is the same, I feel like it's richer and more nuanced just because I have you just collect anecdotes and you have somebody explain something back to you, or you try to explain it and don't see it succeed. I think maybe, and this might even predate the first edition of Interviewing Users, but I think, when you're younger and you learn how to do something and you want everyone to learn how to do it the way that you do it, I think I came up with a certain amount of like, this is the right way to do it. And if you don't do it this way, it's wrong and you have to get better at it. And I have found myself more and more in the context or in the role of not exactly giving permission. It's not that I give people permission to do it, quote, wrong, but that often what I give people just in my teaching role is confidence. That people often come up and say, oh, this thing that you described how to do is hard, and I tried it and I didn't do it very well, and they'll just sort of unpack their failings around it. And I think I'm more aware over the years of, rather than me sort of taking a gatekeeper role, I mean, I hope I never did, but I think perhaps you start with that. Really feeling more like my practice, and this is less about how I practice as a researcher, more how I practice in a community or as a collaborator, is about try to fend off missteps and mistakes ahead of time, point them out when they happened, let people point them out to you, acknowledge that these are all things that we all struggle with. And I like how you started off by saying, like, yeah, we've got experience and we can always get better. And I don't know that if you read the first edition and you read the second edition, you'd be like, wow, Steve's really changed his whole philosophy of, like, the narrative voice here is really different. I don't think that's the case. But certainly there is, I don't know, a way of being in the world and what I look to people to bring and how I want to support them that is different. I don't think I do interviews that much differently than maybe I did, but I think my way of describing it has has evolved as I've just progressed as a person in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great and really thoughtful answer, because I feel like many of us cannot have escaped the context really shifting. I mean, it's kind of the context where we're being asked to deliver insights, or sometimes not as frequently asked to deliver insights as we used to be. And then also the context of the technologies and the situation changing. And actually, I'm going to skip ahead. I have, of course, an interview guide, but I actually want to ask this question because I know it's top of mind for a lot of folks right now, which is really about a lot of people who do interviews, kind of the subset of people who do research, the people who do interviews, are currently experiencing some pretty significant challenges in either getting their organizations to the point where they're embracing doing this work and carving out the time to do it, or at the other end, leveraging in a very intentional way and public way what they're learning from what you've shared. So I just wondered, what advice do you have for those of us who are experiencing those challenges?
Sorry, can you clarify the second part?
Mm-hmm.
Or just
It really
remember it?
is. So it's the how do we get people to do research, right? And to do interviews. And the other part is how do we get organizations to do something with what we've learned?
Yeah.
I think, they hear it and they sometimes don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. And these are evergreen challenges in user research. And I think that we get pulled into feeling that we're in a crisis now. Things are worse. Like and maybe things are worse. It depends what you want to measure, I guess. But the two pieces that you articulated, like no one will let me do research and no one does anything with my research when I do it. Um, I mean, I think I've heard that my entire career, which you put a number on, or I put a number on at 25 years. It's always been like that. And I go back and forth on, um, is that true? What is the nuance there? Because I feel like I just all the time, I'm like, everything is different, nothing is different. I feel like that scene from the face slapping scene from Chinatown, just to make a dated reference for everybody. I feel like I just go back and forth between, or maybe it's genius to hold two conflicting ideas in one's head. There we go. There's my reframe. Um, and I think we don't zoom out to look at sort of, is this a local minima or local maximum? We don't zoom out enough, and we feel like, yeah, this keeps happening. And if I say, well, it's always sucked, that's really not very helpful to anybody. And so I appreciate your question. Um, you know, we actually talk about this now. We didn't really. I think we didn't talk about it in a mature way. So let's just think about the evolution. It was that almost like a stomping the foot thing, like no one listens to me, or I can't. And you mentioned my podcast. My podcast is with people who lead research, and if you go back a certain period of time, there was no one who led research. So at least in terms of an internal activity versus consulting and agencies and other ways of working, there was no leadership. So there was no way that research as a function could talk to peers in other disciplines. If you had only IC researchers who reported to someone that didn't know research, or reported to someone that didn't have, all the sort of infrastructure of how decisions are made in an organization about what are people going to work on. You had people entirely working reactively. So the lament in the past, which I think was still true, and probably everyone can relate to this, which is we get called too late. We get called too late for tactical things where we can't have impact. And there are many people leading in-house corporate and other kinds of structures, research organizations who are involved in understanding what actions and decisions the rest of the business is going to make, or what are the strategic objectives of this company, and proposing research activities that are designed to produce information that informs decisions. And so when it happens at that level, it's not even, a researcher on their own going to someone who's a decision maker and asking them, hey, what decisions are you going to make, or how can this research best be useful? But it's done at like how are priorities being set? And so, talk about maturity, like that's a mature practice. And again, not everyone is there. Probably most people are not there. And if you are there, you're not there all the time. So I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture on it, unnecessarily rosy, but I mean, I think you have, infrastructure and approaches. And, if you don't have leadership, if you work in an organization and you're, an IC, and you don't have leadership that understands what research can do and advocates and prioritizes and collects information and sets tasks and roadmaps with that, what are you, an individual contributor, supposed to do? Like, you can only manage up so far. And so I think, again, if you go back, you had people saying things like, oh, you make small incremental improvements, you find advocates, you build allies, you do all the sort of change agency stuff. And it's changed now because we have a cohort of people who are leading, who have been leading, who have, set up research at organizations A, B, and C. This is not the only metric, but one metric would be like, oh, I think like 70 potential guests in an Airtable for my podcast, people that are in this role and have done it for a while. So if you just look at who makes up our field, I think there's just some data that says it's better than it used to be. So, I'm not really answering your question. I guess I'm just sort of framing the context around it and how do we think about it. What's the best way to be able to have this kind of impact is to work for someone or be that person who has the mandate to create the conditions for success. If you don't have that, it's really hard. I think you can only manage up. And I think it's all these things, right? It's are we going to do research? What research are we going to do? How much time do we have for it? When does it take place? Who's going to act on it? Right? I know you kind of had a multifaceted question, but it's the same thing. It's what does kind of a mature, established research process look like? And it needs to be bought into kind of above the level of research leadership, and it needs to be owned and championed by someone that can do it and kind of own that. You can make incremental improvements, and I bet everyone here has a story about wins that you've made, but you can't convert a whole organization and kind of establish it. And the last thing I'll say is that, and this has been a great theme on the podcast lately, is that some of these folks who have had the mandate and done the work to really change what research is being done and how is it going to be used, have just been so clear that this takes time, this takes years. And so here's all the conditions for success, and it takes years to do that. So if you don't have the mandate, and if you don't have the mandate, then I think you're pushing uphill, and the person with the mandate takes years to accomplish that. So yeah, again, I've not really answered your question, like here's the thing to do, but I think I want to just kind of unpack it and reframe it and follow up, or whatever we want to go next.
Yeah, I actually think that that's a wise answer. And I also think it's reflective of at least how I was reading some of the anecdotes that you share in the book, that essentially are some of these leaders telling their stories about how they did it. And, you probably noticed I was just flipping through the book because actually the last story that's in the book from Manal Chokshi,
Yeah.
I think really, to me, I think what resonated and from that, and then your answer just now, is sometimes you have to make your own luck. And that time piece is really important, because to make your luck, you have to sometimes you have to have a leader who leads people across the organization to come together almost in a research-led, feedback-led way to actually intentionally change how it is that people think about how empathy, research insights from people drives decision making. So that's if you haven't read the book yet, make sure that you read all the stories, because I think those give you some different perspectives on like how to think about that.
And maybe Monal's example is well, it is a great one, and thank you for bringing it up. She kind of exceeded her mandate in that story. I mean, the TLDR on that is that there was siloed research. She got people from disparate teams together despite no one having bandwidth. She kind of brokered creation of a council, and then proactively created insight-led strategy direction that she brought to leadership. So no one asked for this thing. She saw a gap and she got the parties together. So she had enough of a mandate that, she could call these folks up and say, hey, I think we should do this. But she still was stepping way outside, all the structure, reporting and dotted line and everything that she, quote, should be doing. But she saw an opportunity, and she had, I guess, just enough street cred to kind of get people together to do something and to bring it to somebody that wasn't asking it. So that is like a chutzpah story. And I guess the lesson to take from that for someone who doesn't have what Monal had, that kind of opportunity is to kind of find those. But yeah, it makes a great story, and I think it's hard to do that. She was this high up, and she still managed up kind of one rung. But she had a certain amount of credibility to kind of to pull that off. But it is I like your phrase, make your own luck. That is an aspect of that story.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit, because a lot of your book is really dedicated to the tactical, like, how do you just do research, these interviews better. So I'd love to hear more about some of the best, or even some of the surprising things you've learned along the way for helping to encourage people to tell, important stories, or to share just richer information with you.
There's a big piece here about intention. I think this kind of goes to, I want to give people confidence. These are, we use so many words in our discipline that sort of lack meaning, empathy, curiosity, listening, add your own here. And those are qualities that we would all say that we have and that we exhibit, because who would say that they're not curious, or that they're not empathetic, or they're not a good listener? in fact, as I say that, maybe I won't give you all specifics, but I can think of all the times that, oh, gee, they don't have patience to do any of those things. So I don't, we are not Vulcans or some kind of other character from the media. We don't live and breathe these. These are sort of deliberate things that we do. And everybody is more or less empathetic. You just are where you are at different times and different circumstances. But thinking about, again, intention is like, how do I want to go into this interaction with somebody? And choosing how to be and what to do. And I think, you know, I use an old line in the first edition that I think I cut, which was free your mind and your ass will follow. Like I think that intention is really important. So I talk in the book about even just having a little thing that you do before you go to talk to somebody, a transition ritual. It could be a mantra, like reminding yourself that, oh, this next hour is about, is just learning from Gina. Gina has her camera on and got called out. Sorry. I wanted to make it real with like a real person. Yes, okay. Thank you. But just saying that to yourself that this is what you want to do, because right, we all have a lot going on in our minds anyway, and we go into an interview. It's so much harder in remote where everybody's at a computer or maybe a phone right now. And if you're going to hang up from this and go to another session that is completely different, it's just really hard on the brain. And when research was only in person, you would physically go somewhere. So you had a lot of transitional time. You could kind of move from one thing to the next. But to go from a meeting where you're being assigned due dates for project A, and you come out of that like, oh my goodness, I've got to do something, and then turn around and talk to Gina, who's been sitting in the Zoom waiting for the interview, to be present and to be calm and have that intention. You've got to do something kind for yourself. And it's not just because you're a special person to deserve goodness, but you can't perform well if you don't set yourself up with these conditions. And work and calendaring isn't always sort of compatible with that. So it's often upon us to ask for that, so that we can be present. And again, these are very hand wavy words for these tactical kinds of things. But and you have to learn to hear yourself. When are you anxious? When are you distracted? When can you set that aside? How do you kind of help yourself set that aside and feel like, yeah, what this person has to tell me is amazing. It's amazing. I just want to hear it, and it's amazing. And those are sort of mindset things. And so it's not ask follow-up questions to get rich stories. It's be super, super interested in that person, and follow-up questions will come out of your mouth because you want to get more and you want to get more. So it's, what's the tail and what's the dog and what's wagging what. You want to really have that intention. And I don't mean you want to get some insights, you can deliver them in a top line and put them in the Miro, and like hopefully research will be at the table. Like all that is like, you want to be with Gina and just be so interested in what Gina is gonna tell us. And yes, about, the onboarding flow, fine. You have some things you want to get to, but you want to kind of anchor in just that being with somebody else. And I do not live that way. I do not talk to my seatmates on airplanes. I want people to leave me alone a lot of the time. Or I need like a big invitation to kind of come out of my shell and try to do that. This is work with intentional practices. It's not kind of what person that you are in the world all the time.
Yeah, I almost think about that as you're creating almost a performative persona for yourself to, kind of be present in that moment. And it doesn't have to be like you as you are in your personal life or you as you are in your professional life. It's this separate entity that is, you know, that's only engaged when you're doing interviews. I love that. I think that's an elegant way to think about
And
it.
performative is a bad word on social media, right? It's a thing that we're not supposed to be. And yeah, I know I watch people practice asking questions, and it takes some experience to be authentic as that. If you want to frame it as a persona, that it is you, and to be authentic in that. And one of the tactics that I talk about is asking a question that you know the answer to. So this goes back to your how do you get stuff out of people? If you brush over everything that you think you know, like, I don't know, what do you like about, what kind of restaurants do you have in your neighborhood? Well, you live in a neighborhood and you know that, if you take what you know and sort of step over that and don't ask those questions that you know, you miss the chance to be surprised. So that's an intention, but it has a tactic. And what I see people doing when they are sort of practicing research is men and women, right? Their voices get a little higher. There's the curious voice that some people take on. They're like, what what kind of restaurants do you have in your community? Like, you can hear people sort of reach for that authenticity. And yes, this is all practice and practice and reflect. At some point you want to be able to just to embody that curiosity and just say, yeah, Gina, what kind of restaurants do you frequent in your community? And just have it come out as natural as you would ask that. And so, performative and persona, I think, are sort of, accurate, sort of whatever, psychologically, I guess. But I also want people to feel okay being that person. Like, that person is you, and that person is maybe more energized. And like, here I am, I'm using my hands and I'm raising my voice and I'm doing a little performative thing because that's what this context calls for. I am playing a role, and I'm going to switch to another role after this. That's, how we go about our day. So, I agree with you, and I want to just sort of shape that a little bit.
Yeah, that's totally awesome. I love that answer. So I saw a great and I think very exciting announcement this morning that there's the finally Kate Towsey's book on research operations is going to be released later on this summer. I've been waiting for this for a long time. I'm sure a lot of you have as well. And you talk a lot about research operations because obviously there's a ton of connection that you call it like the research infrastructure that enables us to do this work at scale and with a level of quality that is high and consistent. And I think one of the things that I wanted to just cover with you a little bit is with the restructuring that we're seeing with all the changes in the industry, what are some of the best practices and wins that you're seeing around kind of sustaining the momentum that we've built as a maturing profession in this space?
We all have our own sort of footprint in our field, and it seems very hard for me, at least, to get kind of a non-vibey view. So, start your day, open up LinkedIn, scroll through, and you're taking a pulse of a field. That's your external source, and then whatever's going on in our work is another source as well. And so you see these things of, people being laid off. Then you see people announcing new jobs that they've got. You see people announcing that they are sick of looking for work because they're being, abused by a system that doesn't value them. You see people announcing that they're hiring. Like, there's a lot of signals coming at us. And again, what's happening in each of our own practices, like, yeah, it's been a frustrating couple of years for me. In terms of, yeah, markets, whatever, anybody that's trying to sell your work, if stuff closes or doesn't close. And I think we're wired to hear negative signals louder than it's I think comes from fight or flight. If you read two, I got a new job in user research, and you read two, I got laid off from user research, I think you take that on in a more negative way. So, again, I'm trying not to put like a rosy, inaccurate picture on things. Like everybody here, I'm having conversations with my peers, and we're like, "Ooh, like, what's going on?" I'm also having conversations with people that are like, here's how I'm, kicking ass right now. So, um, yeah, there's some inflection point going on here. I don't know what it is. And your question, I guess, was like, your question was also toward the positive. What are the wins? How do we kind of carry those forward? I already gave the whole leadership pitch in terms of the shape of the industry, so maybe I won't repeat that a second time. Um, you know, no one thinks, yeah, when I make a declaration, I can say, well, that's not actually true. User research is accepted, it's acknowledged, it's known, it's believed in. Kate came up with people who do research to label the fact that this is an activity that lots of people are doing and know the word, and even if they aren't confident or think that they're not as good as, quote, a proper trained researcher is, like, the field is established. um, do you ever read like the New York Times or something, and they interview somebody about something completely unrelated, and it says so and so, a user researcher, and you're like, oh my goodness, this is just like a profile, like, a marketing executive or something. Like, we're here. There's what, 123 people on this call. The field is well established, and again, we are going through challenges now, and we don't have the benefit of looking at the current moment with hindsight to say, is this a dip? Is this a local minima? Is this, what's going on? And we're dealing with larger economic forces that are beyond anything that affects us, right? That affects how tech especially is funded, and how, the those kinds of factors that are not about us and our performance and our effectiveness individually or as work. There are other things going on. Um, Again, I don't have like a deep economic analysis here, or somebody is like, people occasionally run the numbers on LinkedIn and say, here's what's happening with job openings. I don't know. I don't know kind of any of that. I guess I just want to kind of reframe it a little bit. Um, there are many of us, and we continue to bring value. We continue to have our value challenged in like practical and impractical ways. Um, I don't know. I stop me before I keep hand waving. I'm gonna like just throw it back to you, and you can press me.
I think that there's some value to the hand waviness, and I say that just because, so I think some things only become clear in retrospect, and we're still so much in the middle of this inflection point that I think everybody's having a hard time creating an effective summary of what it is, why it is, and what's going to happen next. I think it makes it very
And
difficult.
what should we do about it individually?
Yeah.
As an individual, how do I change a system that I can't see, and that is a system with all these factors?
Yeah.
I think, community and community support is amazing. Like the work that you all are doing to bring people together, and that's not the only place that people can spend time, but you're doing a positive thing to let people learn and commune and network like that. I mean, that's a way through a crisis. And if it feels like a crisis, it is a crisis, right? I mean, and if you don't have work, you don't have work. There's no pie chart we can draw to say like, well, don't worry about it because it's your individual situation.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really powerful point. So I did see, so I'm going to take questions now because actually we've had a fair number of questions come in. And two of them have been about remote research, which obviously based on my experience is close to my heart too. But what tips would you have for those folks who, by context or budget or constraints or timeline, find themselves having to leverage remote research? What are some best practices that you could recommend?
There's a ton about this in the book. It's not something that I wrote about very much 10 years ago, although Nate Bolt's remote research book was like 3 years before interviewing users, I think. So we've been talking about remote research for a long time. It's just really become a more established practice now. Um, yeah, I mean, I think we already talked a little bit about the challenges to yourself to stay present and to stay kind of calm and focused and just to set up a schedule that's good for you. I think there's just good meeting hygiene that you can play with. Where do you sit or do you stand? Um, how big do you want the other person's screen to be? Like, there's some interesting science that I cite in the book about. I think this was some people at Stanford at the beginning of the pandemic. They were looking at their research and saying, it's not good for our brains to see faces this big. We have a grid. I see a grid up right now, so that's a little different. But the lag, the imperceptible lag, has some drain on the body. Um, I think you don't have to take the status quo. I think you can have a conversation with your participant about what you want to do. Cameras on at the beginning. Like, I think it's all up for grabs to kind of play with. Cameras on the beginning and cameras off afterwards. Um, um, you know, suggesting what they should do, suggesting what you should do. You can all make it sort of part of the texture because as opposed to pretending like, oh, we're just meeting in normal. No, you're not. You're meeting through this highly mediated bit of unreliable technology. So how do you make that part of how you want to have that collaboration? Um, I think it creates challenges for people about where things go on the screen. Uh, I think we've become more accustomed to being on calls, especially group calls, where someone's kind of looking off to the side. I think that's more normal. Like, I could talk to you like this. I don't know. It feels weird for me to kind of mock this up, but because I don't have a second monitor here, so I'm pretending. Um, but norms keep shifting, right? And so what behaviors kind of happen kind of keep shifting. And so it's an emerging practice. It wasn't like the first year of COVID, we figured it out, and now we just always do it that way. And I think depending on who you're talking to, what situations they're in, you might want to just reflect on those norms kinds of changing. And in norms, I mean very simple, like where do you look? Do you have your camera on or not? How big is it? Right. I'm seated now, but if I was standing, I would have a different physical energy. Um, People have those cameras that track them, that kind of zoom in. And those are interesting because they start to make it feel like you're on television. That's kind of a media thing. Do you want that or do you not want that? I think so. I guess the tip is to review your practices around some fundamental things. What makes for the best recording is a factor, but it's also, is that getting in the way of your rapport or the comfort for your participants? Um, I think there's more maturity in the technology now about how we bring other people in. I think I have a quote in the book there from a research ops person who was saying, if your best practices for observers is telling them to come in muted, then you've already failed, right? Because people will inevitably come off mute and, really change the dynamic of your interview. And I think that quote was in the context of setting something up so that people have a way to observe. And, I don't keep track of what product affords what. In some cases, you have to wire things together across different platforms so people can join invisibly and watch. The stuff keeps changing. But again, the fundamentals are the infrastructure changes, but the fundamentals are creating an experience that is successful for everybody, that's not interrupted, that you asked this question before about like how do you get people to go deeper and kind of share things. Well, just a second, Charles, can you mute please? Is like not the way to do that. You want to not solve the human problem. You want to prevent the human problem from happening. That's just a laundry list of things that I was thinking of.
Yeah, and actually somewhat related to some of the questions that came in earlier in our conversation. But I did want to ask one last question. We've got time, right, Danielle? One more question. All right, awesome. Which really kind of extends what it is that you were just talking about around like how can you help people who are not researchers, kind of set the stage to help be a part of that process. And I think, in the book, you really cover it. I think in chapter 4, where you're talking about like, here's how to get people to be a part of the team. But one of the questions is really also about like, how do you get people to feel psychologically safe to be there, right? And then also just what are some best practices for managing all of the complexity that comes with adding more potential voices to actually those conversations.
And you're talking about colleagues, observers, other people that are, yeah. Right. And I think when we want to get more out of something, we got to put human power into that. So if you have someone interviewing a participant in one sort of virtual room and you have that stream to a back room, like in the old focus group rooms, you have to put somebody in there. You have to have somebody who's going to moderate that. And so I've done things like, been in the back room and modeled discussion and sort of adding color commentary, not for the researcher, the participant to see, but for observers to see. Oh, this is interesting because someone else said that. I wonder this, just keeping that dialogue going. And even when we could get 2 researchers in the back room, we would model a dialogue. And I think for other people who do research to come in and just see us talking about what we were seeing in the interview, I think made a successful experience for them. And so we were modeling it. And so we could say, yes, did anyone have any questions? Or we could see if we were in Slack, right? We could say, you know, at Gina, like, do you have any questions for this? So we also could run interference between the group and ask Gina for a question. If Gina had a question, we have some prearranged way to type that to the person who's running the interview. So they are not just like we're doing here now, right? There's a chat going on. I am not taking questions from the chat. You're moderating that. Somebody else is watching the chat. You got a bunch of people hosting this event to make it successful. It takes people and to focus on different kinds of things. Gina didn't know that you're going to be one of the people that was co-opted into making this a successful event, but thank you, Gina. So yeah, you've got to put people on it to do that and to facilitate, to host, to moderate. You can't get that for free. And if you're the person on this call who's like, yeah, I'm pretty good at having Slack open here and the interview open here and the participant, like, I mean, who am I to tell you, like, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that? I mean, that's great. I cannot do that. I want to just have like full focus and have all that intention and all that presence. Because for sure, and again, this is on a continuum. I will be pulled and I will look at things and I will check things, but I want to set myself up if I'm the leading the interview person for as much kind of focus and presence. So yeah, the short answer is like it takes more people to facilitate, one-on-one interview is just two people. An observable situation that people are going to pop in and out of, it just takes more people to kind of make that happen. And I think that's time well spent to create those kinds of experiences for people.
That's a really great point to end on, because I think that like thinking about that type of interview as being a curated experience is very, very helpful. So as we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to ask, which is, you do so much, right? I talked about what it is that I've heard that you do that's in your bio, but where can people go to learn more about what you're thinking about writing, who you're talking to these days?
So my site is my last name, portigal.com. I have a blog where I mostly just write about, podcasts I've been on or talks that I'm giving or something like that. Also there is info about both my books and my podcast is there. So you can see all the episodes and check those out. And LinkedIn, you can come and weep with me or joyously celebrate with me on LinkedIn, because we can only have those two experiences, one or the other, all good or all horrible. But those are the two places that I share stuff, talk about stuff, and obviously LinkedIn is a more interactive environment. So I'm happy to see you on LinkedIn and like what other people are talking about, because that's how I learn as well.
Yeah, awesome. I want to thank you again so much for this really thoughtful conversation, and encourage those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity to do so to read Interviewing Users, because I think no matter where you are in your journey to becoming a better researcher, I know I try every day to be better. It can be a very valuable resource to help guide you along that path. And also just to remind you, there's a survey, right? So want to get your feedback about today so that we can make this a more enriched experience going forward. And I guess I will turn it back over to Danielle to help guide us through the end of today's session.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this really rich, thoughtful discussion. So I want to announce the winner of our book giveaway. So the favorite question in the chat, I have Ariana Avila talking about virtual versus in-person interviews and some of the strategies and such. So thank you very much, Ariana, for your comment. You will be getting a copy of our next book group book, Invisible Women. So we'll coordinate in the chat with you to get your details to send that over. Okay, for those of you who would like to stick around, we will have our networking breakout sessions. So if you want to continue this discussion in smaller groups, strongly encourage that. So we'll be putting those groups together. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending, and keep an eye out for our upcoming events in July and September.